This was once the richest country with the highest standard of living in all Asia, Malaya. A British colony, Malaya was blessed with unlimited natural resources. For decades, the twin pillars of the Malayan economy, rubber and tin, established massive export markets in the United States. In the 1930s, Malaya topped the list of Britain's dollar earners. World War II, however, had crippled the colony's economy. For nearly 5 years under Japanese control, Malaya was unproductive, and its people lived under strict military rule. With the end of World War II, the returning British power didn't enjoy the wealth and peace they were used to. The communist insurgency, led by the Malayan Communist Party, put the country in a constant state of disorder. This series is about 12 years of terror in Malaya, where the security forces were in jungle green, and the bandits were, most of the time, captured or found dead in khaki brown uniforms. Kuala Lumpur, 2nd of December, 1945. Impressive parades by the 1st Regiment of the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army of the Malayan Communist Party. This part of history comes a long way. Kelly's Castle near Ipoh, Perak, the symbol of Malaya's prosperity prior to World War II. Kelly's Castle was built by Scottish planter William Kelly Smith from Kellas, a little town in Scotland. In 1890, at the age of 20, he arrived in Malaya and came in touch with estate owner Alma Baker. Baker had won concessions from the state government to clear nearly 400 hectares of forest in Perak. Smith made some substantial profits from his business with Baker. This resulted in Smith planting rubber trees. He also was involved in the tin mining industry, which at that time was at its high point in Perak. In time, he became the owner of Kinta Kellas Estate and the Kinta Kellas Tin Dredging Company. With the handsome profits gained from rubber and tin industries, William Kelly Smith built this castle, complete with an indoor tennis court and a lift, first ever built in this country. Malaya developed quickly and soon became the richest country in the British colony. Thousands of miles away in Russia, early October 1917, Vladimir Lenin convinced the Bolshevik Party to form an immediate insurrection against the provisional government. Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, announced his attempt to construct the socialist order in Russia. This new government made up of Soviets and led by the Bolsheviks. It marked the beginning of the worldwide spread of communism in the 20th century. A few years later, in the Far East, Chen Du-xiu and Li Dazhou founded the Communist Party of China in Shanghai as a study society with an informal network. The first Congress, held in July 1921, was attended by only 12. Mao Zedong was present as one of 2 delegates from a Hunan Communist, which had 10 members out of 53 for all of China. In 1931, Mao was elected chairman of the newly established Soviet Republic of China, based in Jiangxi province. After withstanding 5 encirclement campaigns launched by Chiang Kai-shek, Mao led the Red Army on a long, important communist leader. In Malaya, the Chinese were paying very close attention to the development in China. Despite what was happening in China and the Soviet Union, Malaya remained prosperous. But Lenin's teachings, which identified Western imperialism as the highest form of capitalism, began to gain support. Capitalism was regarded as the greatest obstacle to the achievement of the communist goal throughout the world. As early as 1928, a Chinese-led Nanyang Communist Party was formed in Singapore. Communist International, or Comintern, a young Vietnamese communist leader by the name of Lai Tek, to Singapore. He quickly became a Central Committee member of the Malayan Communist Party in 1936. In the same year, he rose to become the Deputy Secretary. In 1939, he finally became the Secretary General, the highest post in the MCP. Throughout British Malaya, MCP had to operate underground by infiltrating legitimate organizations. The party infiltrated the trade unions and became expert activists and masters, and they set up cells in the most important economic sectors, such as rubber, tin, and the railway workshops. Serious strikes began to be coordinated. In March 1937, the Malayan Communist Party scored its first spectacular success when a communist-controlled labor front led 6,000 miners to take control of the country's only coal mine in Batu Arang, Selangor. Though the capture lasted for only 24 hours, it managed to send shock waves through the British colonial administration as a serious attempt by the communists to create chaos in Malaya. Sunday, May 1941, Pearl Harbor. An hour before this attack, on the other side of the international dateline, the Japanese forces had already advanced on the beaches of Malaya in a small fishing village of Sabah in Kota Baru. In just a few weeks, the whole of Peninsular Malaya fell in the hands of the Japanese.
And it is really a change of masters, whether we are better off under the Japanese or better off under the British. A lot of people felt that, the British have lost to an Asian nation, and that is something that they should be happy about. On the other hand, they were very uncertain about the Japanese treatment. They think it will be very oppressive.
The biggest blow to Britain in this Pacific theater was the sinking of the Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. These were the first British capital ships to be sunk by air attack while operating on the high seas. Finally, on the 15th of February 1942, the victorious Japanese General Yamashita settled the terms of surrender with General Percival. The 4 years of Japanese rule had just begun. Clothing, food, and medicine were scarce.
But of course, always you think in food first. Food was extreme shortage. And rice for those working is 4 gantangs. So if in a family, only my father works, it's 4 gantangs for 1 month. And you got to survive in that 4 gantang. So you got to supplement it by using every inch of ground available to you. And we were in government quarters, and it's very little ground in government quarters. So you have to grow your own tapioca, your own clay, your own vegetables, because purchasing these things is very expensive. And what the Japanese were paying for My father, when he worked, he hardly can buy anything.
The Japanese punished the Chinese most severely. This was because they had actively helped China in its fight against Japan.
For me, of course, as a Malay, I did not fear the Japanese because to us, they are just another colonialist. And whether they are going to be oppressive or not is something that concerns the Chinese.
The indiscriminate killing of the innocent civilians drove the Chinese in the communist guerrillas. Party membership increased from a few hundred to a few thousand soon after the occupation. The communist guerrillas known as the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army became the most organized fighting force to oppose the Japanese occupation in Malaya. MPAJA was not alone. In 1943, the British established Southeast Asia Command in Colombo, Sri Lanka, for an eventual British invasion to liberate Malaya. To achieve this, they created a special unit called Force 136 to operate behind Japanese lines in Malaya. And in May 1943, Force 136 made initial contact with MPAJA. Just before World War II started, a few young Malay soldiers were undergoing military training in India. Among them were Malaysia's third Prime Minister-to-be, Hussein On, and Malaysia's future Chief of Armed Forces, Ibrahim Ismail.
Now, the idea of 136 was to send agents into the occupied territory of Malaya under the Japanese occupation. So the training was constructed as for agent, to be an agent to collect intelligence. Now the training will embrace the usual, first of all, fitness and jungle training in order to prepare ourselves to do the jungle, to live in the jungle, and then later, and then the coupled with intelligence training, intelligence gathering training, and also in preparation for actual landing by flying boat.
However, Ibrahim's mission was short-lived. He was captured soon after he landed via seaplane in Pulau Perhentian in the South China Sea. This was the only landing of Force 136 via seaplane. Other landings were successfully achieved without detection via submarines. Major John Davis made a few landings around Pankor Island, where on the second landing he met a man named Chin Peng for the first time. Chin Peng was the Malayan Communist Party's liaison officer with Force 136. He then guided John Davis and his men from Lumut to Blanton Camp near Cameron Highlands. Here in Blanton Camp on the 31st of December 1943, the first agreement between the British and the Malayan Communist Party was signed. In the agreement, the MPAJA agreed to cooperate and accept orders and instructions from Southeast Asia Command. The British, on the other hand, would give assistance to the MPAJA by supplying them with funding, new arms, ammunition, explosives, and training. The document was signed by Major John Davis on behalf of the British and Lai Tek on behalf of MCP. At this moment in Blanton Camp, no one knew that Lai Tek was also working with the Japanese Kamputai. (1945). While the United States was busy preparing to take over Japan, in India, under the command of Lord Mountbatten, the British were occupied with strategies on how to invade Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It followed with a second bomb on the city of Nagasaki on August 9. 100,000 people were killed in both cities. The news quickly reached Malaya. 15 August 1945, the Japanese surrendered. The Japanese army began to withdraw from remote parts of Malaya into the big cities. The Chinese guerrillas of the Malayan People's anti-Japanese army had now emerged from the jungle. For at least 2 weeks, the MPAJA took control of Malaya. The reign of terror began.
If they could, the MPAJA would have killed me also. In fact, after the Japanese surrender, and I was demobilized, I was at the Jokyu Shihang Gakko in Kayang, in the higher normal training, teachers training. So when we were demobbed, I went back by train. On the way back, we were all in Japanese uniform but no guns. Our train was ambushed in Slim River. So some of them, like Malay boys, all this. We were so packed, some of them were killed and just rolled off the railway line and died. Later on, when I arrived at the Ipoh station, I stepped on the platform. The MPAJ came, machine gun the platform.
Many Malay headmen were captured and executed.
Of course, there were these dreadful reprisals going on. The MPAJA had old scores to pay off, mainly against Malays. The police were very often the targets of these attacks. A number of policemen, a number of Malay headmen had been assassinated, captured and assassinated, and the police had just refused to do their duty. I mean, I don't blame them. If they'd tried to go out and do their duty, they simply would have been bumped off. Dato' Abdul Malik bin Yusuf, who was district officer Remba during the Japanese occupation, went to his district office to resume duty, and the MPAJA said, "We're not having that. There's a Chinese Republic, haven't you heard?" And they tied him down across the top of his desk and discussed whether to cut his throat. Up in Jelebu, they invaded the district office and said all these records are Kempatai records, and they burnt them so that all the invaluable land records were destroyed. And they arrested the acting undang and tied his hands behind his back and paraded him through the street.
The formal signing of the Japanese surrender took place on September 2nd in Tokyo Bay aboard the battleship Missouri. By this time, the British soldiers had already landed in the west coast of Malaya. Morab Beach in Selangor, one of the planned landing sites in an operation called Zipper. However, there was no Operation Zipper. The British Army landed unopposed.
We landed on the second day. We landed in the dark, and we got into one of these flat-bottomed landing craft and set off in the dark. And after a bit, we bumped into something, and they put the front of the landing craft down and said, "You're in Malaya, chaps, walk." And we walked into 4 feet of water because they'd run into a sandbank offshore. So we waded ashore, wet up to the thighs and pretty miserable. And I think I'm not a very good soldier. I fell in forward to Morib village, so I was in pretty poor shape. Well, then we had to hang around because we couldn't move away. I was with the detachment of the BMA that was going to Negri Sembilan. There was nothing to stop us going there except that we couldn't walk. It was too far. We hadn't got any vehicles. So we had to wait in Morib village for 2 days.
As the BMA took control of Malaya, there was no role given to the MPAJA. not even guard duties. Suspected as a British agent, Lai Tek, the Secretary General of the Malayan Communist Party, persuaded his men to disband MPAJA and hand over weapons. On the 2nd of December 1945, impressive parades were held by MPAJA in Kuala Lumpur and other cities in Malaya. This heralded the end of MPAJA. But the guerrilla movement of the Malayan Communist Party had not yet ended. This was once the richest country with the highest standard of living in all Asia, Malaya. A British colony, Malaya was blessed with unlimited natural resources. For decades, the twin pillars of the Malayan economy, rubber and tin, established massive export markets in the United States. In the 1930s, Malaya topped the list of Britain's dollar earners. World War II, however, had crippled the colony's economy. For nearly 5 years under Japanese control, Malaya was unproductive, and its people lived under strict military rule. With the end of World War II, the returning British power didn't enjoy the wealth and peace they were used to. The communist insurgency, led by the Malayan Communist Party, put the country in a constant state of disorder. This series is about 12 years of terror in Malaya, where the security forces were in jungle green, and the bandits were, most of the time, captured or found dead in khaki brown uniforms. They came, they fought, they conquered, but only for 3.5 years. World War II was over, and the Japanese were on their way home, defeated.
For those who went to English school like myself, we seem to be very pro-British. In fact, when the Japanese came here, after some time, we were hoping that the British would come back.
Well, I first arrived in Singapore, but there had been no Operation Zipper as far as I was concerned because the atomic bomb had stopped the war. So we landed as a normal fashion at Singapore docks in a ship.
Singapore, 12th of September 1945, at the council chambers of the municipal building. Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command, Lord Louis Mountbatten, accepted the formal surrender of the Japanese forces. The surrender document, called Instrument of Surrender of Japanese Forces, was signed at 0341 hours GMT by Lord Mountbatten and by Lieutenant General Itagaki, the Chief of the Southern Army, on behalf of the Emperor of Japan. The next day, in Kuala Lumpur, General Yamashita's representative, General Tiezo Ishiguro, handed over his sword to Lieutenant General O.L. Roberts as a symbol of the unconditional surrender of the Japanese forces in Malaya. This ceremony was held at the Victoria Institution, a school converted into British military headquarters. Soon, the returning British Army was on parade in Kuala Lumpur.
The local population welcomed us. They were delighted to see us. They were immediately on our side. Well, of course they were, because we were liberating them. And the country very quickly went back to more or less normal, because immediately the estates were opened up again. And after the years of Japanese neglect, or just they were left, they had to be cleaned up.
And then I went up to Penang, and I had an absolutely wonderful job on Pulau Jojak, looking after refugees and displaced persons. Well, the camp was about 2,000 people. We were using the old buildings of the pre-war immigration department, and we were feeding and housing people until they could get back to their own countries or their own states in Malaya or wherever. These are all people who had been displaced by the Japanese during the war as laborers or carpenters or whatever.
On the 14th of September 1945, Lieutenant General O.L. Roberts made the first radio broadcast addressing the people of Malaya. In the broadcast, he warned that unruly elements would be dealt with severely. But in this important address, no mention was made to the role of the Malayan Communist Party, a close British ally in fighting the Japanese.
Now, we had been given a collection of printed proclamations, things about the size of a broadsheet newspaper. The principal one was a statement by Mountbatten that he was assuming authority as Supreme Allied Commander to exercise military government over Malaya, because if he didn't do that, then all the treaties with the sultans came back into force, and we should have required state councils and British residents and all sorts of things, and that wasn't the plan at all.
The vacuum left by the sudden Japanese surrender from the 15th of August till mid-September 1945 had given the communists a great chance to rule on their own.
I remember very well the Japanese coming to the country. I remember very well being involved in one derailment of a train in which I was traveling by the MPAJA when I was only about 4 years old, I think, you know. And then I remember the reign of terror after the Japanese surrender. And I remember the killing of my uncles. So that shaped my view of the communist terrorists. So to me, they were terrorists.
There was really no authority in Malaya. You may say that from the moment we got there, we did what we came with troops. I mean, a brigade of the Indian Army had landed at Port Dickson and they'd reached Seremban, and they were spreading out. But troops moving along roads in lorries are not the substitute for a police force and a law-abiding community. And it was a scary situation. I mean, we never really doubted that we would come out on top, but we didn't know quite how long it was going to take and what was going to happen meanwhile. But gradually it got better. But there's no doubt about it that between the middle of August and the middle of September, there was anarchy and mass murder in Malaya.
But why, during those fragile moments, the Communist Party didn't seize power and declare Malaya a People's Republic, as they had always been fighting for? Could the directive of Lai Tek, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, to accept the colonial rule be a sign that he was working extremely close with the British? This question remains unanswered even till this day.
They were merely anti-Japanese, but they thought that if they could defeat the Japanese, they could rule this country. Of course, the British came fairly soon after and put a stop to that. But actually they thought that if the British didn't come, they would have ruled this country. In fact, their plan was the Japanese would not surrender. They didn't think of the Japanese surrendering. Their plan was to fight together with the British when the British forces land here in order to take over Malaysia. So that is their plan. But of course, the Japanese surrendered and all the plans went haywire.
The disbandment of MPAJA, however, was settled for a price. First, the British paid each MPAJA member $350 million, plus a sack of rice. Then, the British military administration had to recognize the Malayan Communist Party as a legitimate political party.
I was in the British Army before I was commissioned in the Gurkha Rifles at Dehradun. And from there, although I wanted to go back to a Scottish regiment, they said, oh no, we won't like you to go to the 9th Gurkha Rifles. So I was posted to the 9th Gurkha Rifles. And then each Gurkha regiment had 5 battalions, active battalions in the field, and the one I went to was the 3rd 9th. From Imphal, Burma, Siam, down through Malaya when I was with them, to Singapore, back to Malaya, and then we went to Sumatra, from where I was demobilized and went home. That was in 46.
1946, an important year for the people of Malaya. Stability had been established. The economy was picking up. Miners were back in business. In just a short while, Malaya's tin export began to top the world's tin trade once again. About this time, the United States imported over 100,000 tons of tin. Almost all came from Malaya. The British military administration ushered in the new year of 1946 with an impressive ceremony parade held at the Singapore Municipal Building. On the 6th of January 1946, Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia Command Lord Louis Mountbatten pinned the Burma Star and 1939-45 Star on 16 members of the resistance forces from the MPAJA, Kuomintang Chinese, and Watanya. All were trained by the Force 136. The ribbons for these prestigious medals were designed by King George VI himself. Among the recipients of the medals was a 22-year-old MPAJA man by the name of Ong Bun Hua, alias Chin Peng. April 1946. The transitional British military administration was replaced by a civilian administration. Sir Edward Gent became the first High Commissioner. The new British civilian government then introduced a new constitution for Malaya, the so-called Malaya. The British were still in World War II victory mode. In May 1946, some of those who fought the Japanese were chosen to represent Malaya in the Victory Parade in London. The former members of the MPAJA were also invited. Once again, the leaders of MPAJA reunited with Force 136 Commander John Davis. Major Ibrahim Ismail of Force 136 was also at the parade as second in command of the Malayan contingent. An honor for the young officer, Major Ibrahim escorted the Queen as she accompanied the King to inspect the Malay regiment. While these soldiers were in London, back in Malaya, the Malays were occupied with the issues of Malayan Union.
We realized that the British were not the most powerful people that we thought they were. They could be defeated by the Japanese. So if they could be defeated by the Japanese, so there is hope that Asian people, Malays, can rule their own country. But this was still a very vague kind of nationalism. But what really stirred up the Malays really was the proposal to have the Malayan Union.
They were angry. First, the extent to which the rulers were stripped of sovereignty. Second, the granting of citizenship to immigrants.
In my memory, of course I was very young and you don't know nearly enough to make judgments really, but at that time it was very peaceful and competitive except for straight crime. The only problem was straight crime. I had no sense at all of political turbulence. It wasn't until I went down to Johor Bahru, which was my next job, that one began to get the feeling of the turbulence. But the turbulence was about Malay nationalism, Indonesian nationalism. It wasn't about Chinese communism yet. No, we're talking about 1946.
Spearheaded by Johor Chief Minister Dato' On Jaafar, the Malays gathered in Johor Bahru on the 11th of May, 1946. On that day, the United Malays National Organization, UMNO, was born. The economy was steadily growing. With the end of World War II, raw materials were in high demand. Like tin, rubber was another important source of dollars in the colonial empire. Malaya supplied nearly 2/3 of the United States rubber imports. The returning estate owners had to put things in order quickly to meet the demand.
I was at university before the war, and my parents wanted me to go back, but I didn't want to go back. I didn't feel that studying was a thing that I wanted to do then. I'd prefer to go. And when I went to London, I saw by chance Harrison Crossfields, and I met some directors, and they said, "Macintosh, why do you thinking about India? Why not go to Malaya, which you came down through and you enjoyed very much, go back as a rubber planter?" And I said, "Oh no, thanks. My parents want me to go to university." But before I got home to the north of Scotland, there was a ticket for me waiting to go in a ship from Liverpool to Singapore, and I went. And that was in early 47, so I stayed there all the time.
From 1946 to 1948, rubber estates began to hire more manpower. At this point, John Edington, a former Scottish Fusilier, arrived to work on a rubber plantation.
Everything was utility in England that time. Arriving out in Malaya, you could buy anything providing you had the money. The shops were full of things, cold storage in Johor Bahru. I was very taken with this, and of course it was wonderful for me, having left Malaya as a child at the age of 6. As soon as I arrived off Penang, I could smell Malaya again, and it was a tremendous thrill. It really was. I was so glad. It was like being home, coming home. We went to Tebrau. I was introduced to my boss there, and after that, by this time it was dark, driven up to Kulai Young. So I only saw the road going up to Kulai at night, and then arrived on the estate. frangipani trees in the garden, the smell coming off the frangipani, it was wonderful.
Meanwhile, the Malayan Communist Party had been operating legally from their headquarters at Forge Avenue in Kuala Lumpur. Strongly driven by their ideology, the MCP made efforts to infiltrate the trade unions in exploiting popular discontent at workplaces. In the beginning of 1947, labor unrest became commonplace. By this time, Lai Tek, the moderate Secretary-General of the Malayan Communists, appeared from Kuala Lumpur. This committee decided to appoint 26-year-old Chin as the new Secretary-General. And 1947 continued to be a chaotic year for Malaya. This is a story about 12 years of terror in Malaya. The communist insurgency of 1948 to 1960 had caused mayhem in the country. During this time, the security forces were in jungle green, and the bandits were, most of the time, caught or found dead in khaki brown. "8,000 miles away from Malaya. The year was 1948. Britain's Labour government was deeply concerned with the development in Eastern Europe. In Czechoslovakia, a Soviet-engineered coup d'etat had the government. Soviet expansion and the spread of communism were really happening. Meanwhile, in Malaya, industrial unrest continued. The Chinese-dominated Malayan Communist Party had been successful in infiltrating the labor unions. Strikes were rampant. In the 12 months from April 1947, 500,000 man-days were lost in Malaya due to strikes.
Nearly every estate had problems, strikes, and mainly strikes at that time. I just got the taste of it in the office with this, I think his name was Naidu, this chap who was creating a noise in the office and arguing, and I think it was about money, something to do with money, he hadn't been paid enough. And anyway, he swore and threatened, and my boss said, well, you go, and he went. And 2 or 3 days later, there was a strike on Senai Estate, and this chap, Naidu, was down there. So all the estates had that sort of trouble. Mm-hmm. Before that, we could hear at night, there was a lot of rumblings going on in the workers' quarters.
Assaults on European planters began to take place. On the 7th of October 1947, Archibald Nicholson, a European planter, was killed in an ambush by armed bandits. He was the first of 99 European planters who were to die during the course of the emergency. In early 1948, an international communist conference was held in Calcutta, India. The Malayan Communist Party sent a junior participant. A month later, the 4th plenum of the MCP was held in Singapore. After attending the Calcutta conferences, traveling back by sea was L. Shaki, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Australia. Sharkey made a stopover in Singapore and supposedly played a considerable part in persuading the Malayan communists to adopt a policy of violence. Finally, on June 16, 1948, in Sungai Siput, Perak, the Communist Party of Malaya opened fire. The 12-year course of the emergency had just begun. On the morning of the 16th of June 1948, the Malayan Communist Party murdered 3 European planters on their respective estates in Sungai Siput, Perak. First, at 8:30 a.m., Arthur Walker, the manager of the Elphil estate, was shot at point-blank range. The second attack occurred half an hour later at Sungai Siput estate, about 2 miles away from Elphil. In a more deliberate attack, the communists did not only kill the 55-year-old manager John Allison and his 21-year-old assistant Ian Christian, they also torched the smokehouse full of rubber ready for shipment. Dense black smoke could be seen from miles away for the entire day. On this very same day, the state of emergency was declared in Perak. 2 days later, 20 miles north of Johor Bahru, bandits attacked the village of Jeram Cho and its police station. 18th of June, 1948, emergency was declared in Johor. Planter John Edington remembers clearly what happened on that day.
I hadn't gone to the field that particular day. I had left to do something. Perhaps I was doing some work in the bungalow. My boss was down in the office, or I think, but then first I remember was this jeep arriving with a Gurkha captain and his driver, and he saluted smartly at the door, introduced himself as Willie Wilcock, and said that things were not too good, but he had come to seek permission to billet soldiers on the estate.
John McIntosh was not far from Kuala Lumpur when his manager asked him to immediately go to the troubled Elphil estate in Sungai Siput.
He asked me to please, Wally Walker has been killed, go to Elphil estate as quickly as you can and try and get Margaret Walker to Derek and Gladys Bloodton. He was the most senior manager on Sepang. And I got to Sungai Siput. The OCPD thought I was mad and they didn't want to allow me to go there, but I had to go. And the kind chap gave me a Sten gun and 3 magazines of ammunition. But when I got to Elphil, Charlie Ross had done my job for me, unknown to Bill Pownall or me. Charlie, a Guthrie planter from Kemenangan in Sungai Siput, had already taken Margaret away. So I was alone there, but joined in 2 days or so by 2 ex-Indian Army chaps that I had known previously. One was to look after Sungai where there was no manager, and the other to look after Finsun, where Allison and Christensen were killed.
On the 23rd of June, the emergency was extended throughout Malaya. The Malayan Communist Party was declared illegal, and its members were detained by the police. Those who were quick enough took to the jungle.
Nothing of the sort that happens in other places happened in Kaprabatas. I don't recall houses and shops being burned. No recollection of estate managers being shot at, murdered, or assassinated. None of this what happened. But everybody know about the emergency. That's one thing. Because there's so much in the newspapers, and people talk about it. And the film unit was very busy. Went to places, and of course, film unit came to Pulau Batas regularly to show us films, pictures of what happened in other parts of Malaya at the time, showing the brutality of the city. City means communist terrorists. So we know the whole story actually.
Murder, panic, pillage, arson. Malaya was engulfed in a life and death struggle. Communist terrorists from their jungle hideouts struck at Malaya's basic industries, intimidated labor, destroyed factories and machinery, wrecked communications, and murdered all those who dared defy. In the first months of the emergency, Malaya's industries came almost to a standstill. The communist terrorists gloated as mines fell idle, as estates were deserted, as vital communications were disrupted. There seemed to be no defense against this ruthless and indiscriminate enemy. Whole villages were razed to the ground because the people would not support their cause or accept their alien ideology. It was the small man, the peasant producer, and the worker who suffered most from terrorist crimes. And it was this very section of the population whom the communists claimed to represent. The people of Malaya, stunned by the atrocities, almost lost heart. It was a time of doubt, despondency, and despair. It was a time of crisis. It was a time of fear.
For many days, the people of Sungai Siput were stunned by the events of the 16th of June. Peace and order, however, was quickly installed.
The atmosphere was relatively calm. I was surprised. And as I have told you, we didn't have any watchman or anything. I had my own watchman, that was all I had, and I had one double-barrel shotgun and a pistol. H&C Singapore dispatched by rail to me at Sungai Siput railway station 24 Malay watchmen. And these watchmen kept 6 and put on Sungai Kruda, Sungai Rela, and Finsun estates. And then, of course, we started erecting barbed wire round the workers' quarters and round the plantation bungalows. And soon I was joined by a Gurkha battalion, 1st, 6th Gurkhas, who came to look after us.
A great advantage for the rubber estates was that most of the European planters hired prior to the start of the emergency were war veterans.
It wasn't what you knew, it was who you knew in these days. There were about 6 of us up for the same job. One was another, well, they were all ex-officers, barring one. I was in uniform, Lieutenant, Royal Scots Fusiliers, and I suppose might have created a better impression, I don't know. But in these days, it's rather like recruiting for your own plantation. You go somewhere where you know you've got somebody suitable, and you hire them, you take them on.
Oh, and another noteworthy thing which surprised me in those days was the High Commissioner of Singapore and Malaya, Malcolm MacDonald, came to visit me. No escort. And this was in July, which I thought was quite amazing. And the doctor, you've heard of him, Dr. Reed Tweedy, who was the visiting medical officer, continued to go round and visit the estates and our individual dispensaries all during that period.
Apart from being a medical man, and no medical man was attacked, at that time I was the only private medical practitioner in the village of Sungai Siput. Well, it's quite inevitable that with a large Chinese population, one or two of these people may have had relatives who were CTs, as they called them, communist terrorists. So, of course, what was the point of killing me? There was no one then to look after the sick.
Gua Musang, the southernmost town in Kelantan. 60 years ago, it was one of the loneliest and most isolated villages in Malaya, only connected with the rest of the world by rail, provided there was no sabotage. About a month after the emergency was declared in Malaya, Gua Musang was captured by the communists. 300 bandits stormed the police station. Heavy fighting ensued until the police ran out of bullets. One policeman was killed and 15 others surrendered. For 5 days, the communists held this small township. Finally, the security forces managed to drive the bandits out. However, in this encounter, 7 men of the Malay regiment and their British officer were killed. In London, pressure was mounting. The bandit attacks in Malaya had more or less disrupted Britain's economy. Security forces needed to be strengthened. The Colonial Office issued advertisements looking for young men to be sent to Malaya. Sitting at his house in England after completing his duty in Palestine, Paddy Giles learned about the opportunity in Malaya at the outset of the emergency.
I come from a colonial family. My own father was a police officer in the Middle East, almost entirely in the Middle East, from the end of the First War right up until 50s, middle 50s. And I decided that I wanted to work overseas. I didn't want to work in England. The question of Malaysia, of me going to Malaysia, came up at the time that Malaysia's emergency was about to be declared and the Colonial Office were looking for people. They got, of course, a lot of people from Palestine, from the Palestine police, because Palestine was packing up at that time, was the mandates being handed over. But they still needed more, and that's where I came in. So I was interviewed, selected, and I was out there pretty quickly. Initially, inevitably, I thought of the Middle East because that's where my background was. I spoke Arabic and that sort of thing. But there were no openings there, and I was very happy, therefore, to go to further east to Malaysia. A decision which I have never regretted.
Several weeks after the emergency was declared, security forces began to arrive. Some by ship and some by plane.
We got on the plane and then we went. Now the lowest form of accommodation on aeroplanes is economy class. We weren't economy, we were cattle class. Because they were wartime aeroplanes, Dakotas. They had these seats, webbing seats, You sat in fours, sometimes in twos. If one got up, the other went down. They did that the whole time. So we got on board and we went. The trip took, what does it take to Malaysia now? 12 hours, I think. It took 4 days. There was no flying at night, so we had to go down and sleep the night on the ground. I think our first stop was Malta. There were 30 odd people on the plane. Most of them were, in fact, the Palestine reinforcements. So mostly young men, and they were going, all of us, to a country which we didn't know.
By September 1948, Sir Henry Gurney arrived in Malaya to succeed Sir Edward Gent, who was killed in an air crash in the UK. This is a story about 12 years of terror in Malaya. The communist insurgency of 1948 to 1960 had caused mayhem in the country. During this time, the security forces were in jungle green, and the bandits were, most of the time, caught or found dead in khaki brown. China, the People's Liberation Army, led by Mao Zedong, had almost accomplished their mission. By the end of January 1949, Beijing was taken over by the communists without a fight. On October the 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and his troops, together with 2 million refugees, fled to the island of Taiwan. Delighted with the development in China, the Communist Party of Malaya intensified ambushes on security forces. Adopting the guerrilla tactics from China, they struck and disappeared back into the jungle. By this time, many whom had just arrived from the UK had experienced their first taste of the emergency. Policeman Paddy Giles was accompanying his boss to a hospital one day.
Visiting people in hospital because they had been in a gunfight, and we were going to meet 2 of the wounded. One of them was Hisham bin Haji Nawawi. I remember him well. He'd already been decorated for gallantry once, and then he got another one. Marvellous man. He'd been shot in the arm. His arm was in plaster, but the blood was coming out still. And I thought, well, you know, I've just come from England where these things didn't happen.
At the beginning of the emergency, the government was poorly prepared.
My first few months was on rubber estates, organising the defences, recruiting Malay mata-matas, khas, special constables, teaching them to shoot with very equally ancient guns, but the ammunition was very duff, useless. Organising the defences, putting up barbed wire, teaching them basic jungle craft, but how I was expected to teach jungle craft coming from the deserts of Palestine. I think it's a rather strange thought.
For the police, the jungle green uniform was not standard government issue until 1949.
And of course the police were not organised for jungle operations. They were organised for ordinary police work. And it was suddenly you had all these special constables and trying to organise the defence of the rubber estates and that sort of thing. The expansion was enormous, and the administrative arrangements in police headquarters were strained to absolute limit, and things were pretty chaotic. And it was only in 1949 that we started getting jungle green, for example. We didn't get tinned rations in the police until well into the 50s or 51. I mean, when we went into the jungle in those early days, the police wives used to cook up sambal and put it in brill cream bottles, and we carried rice in our socks and things like that in our packs. And we took dried fish, ikan kering, which we cooked up, and you ate it along the backbone. We could exist up to a week.
When the emergency was declared in 1948, security forces were entirely under strength, with just 10,000 police plus another 12,000 auxiliaries. The military had only a few battalions, including just 2 Malay regiments. More men had to be taken in. Many still remember the early days.
There were quite a number of us youngsters quite interested to join. So about 10 of us joined the police force, and we were known as trainees. We were not inspectors, we are not cadets, nothing. We were just called trainees, and the 10 of us were put under a shed, which they now call the band house in the police barracks there. So we lived there for 12 months, and every day we had very strict training. But after 12 months, we were made Inspector Muda, probationary inspector. Okay? Then from then, very shortly, there was a shortage of policemen all over. So government opened up training depots. So one was in Tanjung Rambutan, where the loonies are there. So we went and shared with them, you see. And we used to train a few hundred policemen. And I was there for about 3 years training the police for jungle warfare and others.
For the Malayan Chinese, joining the security forces was a tough decision.
So I decided that maybe I join the police. I mean, if we don't fight, who's going to fight? At the time, the Chinese sometimes takut also, see, takut to join, you see. So I said, how can I mean, you get the citizenship. If everybody doesn't want to go and fight, then who's going to do the fighting? And I knew one thing, that we cannot afford to lose to the communists. Because if we lose to the communists, the Tunku won't have a chance to negotiate, you see. So people of my generation, we join, we cannot afford to lose. No doubt some people say, oh, why you help the British to fight? So I say, we are not Bodo. If the British lose, we lose also. So we have to win this. And of course, when you start fighting the communists, you are Chinese, they try to assassinate you. And that's how, when I joined the depot, I came out. I was very enthusiastic. Within 6 months, I was shot by the communists.
Volunteers were also recruited as special constables, home guards and auxiliary police. Temporary female searchers were also recruited. Former British Army personnel who became estate managers and some experienced ex-Palestine policemen quickly undertook the task of training the special constables.
I spent a few months in Johor Bahru. I was supposed to be helping with special constables on the estates, uniforms and weapons and things like that. Also, trying to learn about being a police officer. One of the estates I used to visit was at Kulai, where the assistant manager was a man called John Eddington.
By this time, the Gurkhas had left, so we used this particular bungalow for the special constables. I took them on afternoon when the work was over. I took them and taught them field craft and weapon training, how to shoot and use the weapons, and drill. Gave them plenty of drill, because that's the best thing, to get people doing things the way you want them to do it.
During this time, Abdul Razak Hussain, Malaysia's future Prime Minister, was in England to further his studies. However, his friends in Force 136, Major Ibrahim Ismail and Captain Hussein On, were busy setting up the Kampong Guards under the instruction of Dato' On Jaafar.
Dato' On, as Menteri Besar, realized that the Malays in the kampong must be protected. They must be able to defend themselves against the possible communist attacks. So the only way is to get the Malays in the kampong, especially the kampong, to organize themselves.
In the early days, battlegrounds were not necessarily out in the thick jungle. On the 12th of July 1948 in Ampang, in the vicinity of Kuala Lumpur, 4 communists were killed and 15 captured. By the end of 1948, 600 communists were eliminated, and in 1949, the MCP suffered nearly 1,000 dead. Policeman James McNabb of McNabb remembers his first encounter with the communists.
And suddenly a shot rang out, and I looked to the right, and there was a chap behind a tree with a cap with a red star on it and a rifle pointing at me. And that's where army training kicks in, and I immediately ran to the right and threw a grenade at him, which went off with a loud bang, which startled everybody.
By this time, the security forces had upgraded their defenses. Prefabricated defense posts were erected at strategic locations. Roadblocks were conducted more extensively. The entire country had now prepared for the worst. Thursday, 23rd of February, 1950. The Chinese were still in the New Year celebration mood. A group of communist bandits, led by a Malay leader, Mat Indra, had gathered around the village of Bukit Kepong near Pago in Johor. The target was the isolated police station by the Muar River.
So on the 22nd, I went on a routine visit to Bukit Kepong police station. We were there the whole day. This is 22nd, and it was Chinese New Year period. We found a lot of, at least there were a lot of new faces around. Sergeant Jamil said, oh, we got a lot of new faces around because this is Chinese New Year. That didn't affect us at all. After lunch in the Pengulu's house, we went on a cycle patrol. Pengulu, Sergeant Jamil, myself, and a few others, we went all around a cycle patrol. We finished at about 6:30. By 7:30, I was at the wharf ready to go off. And on the wharf, as usual, we had the kampung people, the Penghulu, the Sergeant Jamil and all these men at the wharf just to wish us goodbye. And here is an interesting episode. Just before the boat left, as usual, I just told Sergeant Jamil, he's the sergeant in charge, in a friendly way I said, "Hey, to Jamil, jaga baik-baik ya, tempat ini berbahaya." I said with a smile, but the immediate reaction from him was, he stood to attention, very officious, and gave me a salute. And he says, "Jangan bimbang Tuan OCPD. Biar tolong putih. Jangan putih mata." Then he saluted again, and there was silence.
Just before dawn, the communists launched the guerrilla assault. A bloody shootout ensued. Superior in numbers and arms, the communists believed they would be able to gain control of the police station within a short time. Yet, the policemen, led by Sergeant Jamil Muhammad Shah, held out till the last round. Several men were killed as the shooting continued. 2 wives of the defending officers took up arms as they found their husbands had been killed. In the fierce battle, the communists set fire to the officers' barracks and station. 2 women and their children were burnt to death in the married quarters. At this point, only 3 policemen and a village guard were still alive defending the post. Numerous calls were made by the communists, but the policemen refused to surrender.
Short while later, information arrived by Sampan. Kampung people came by Kampung to said that they heard firing in Bukit Kapong. So I did 2 things. One, I alerted the police officer in charge of operations in Mua, see, at about 8 o'clock, see. So somehow he managed to get the RAF for the loan of an Oster. In those days, they only had an Oster thing, so they went. And in the meantime, I went. So when I reached Lenga police station, he reported, that is the British operations officer, police officer reported more. He said, "Hey, I flew over your police station. I think it's in flames."
The place was ablaze. The total number of deaths was 25. The men and women could have saved themselves by surrendering, but they chose to fight till the last bullet.
There was no police boats. The one boat that we had brought me to Lenga police station and went back to Bukit Kapong. And there the communists burned the boat. So I had no boat. So we had to walk all the way, and we arrived there about 9 something. Walking through jungle, there was no road at all. And we saw the carnage there. The communists had just left.
Arriving at the scene later were the Chief Minister of Johor, Dato' On Jaafar, accompanied by Major Ibrahim Ismail.
When I first, I was shocked to see the whole police station had been burned down. There were still a few corpses lying on the ground. Amongst them was a corpse of a mother holding a baby. And I've never seen a burnt out body before, and it really shocked me.
Dr. On arrived, and he was very concerned about the whole thing, but he was very steady. I went and reported to him. He listened for about a minute. Then he said, go back to your men. Go and look after your men. So I went off. And of course there we found the various things. It dawned on us that sergeant had the opportunity to surrender. And this, I will say this for many years to come, as long as I live. Why did this man not surrender? There was something in him, the fighting spirits of his ancestors or soul. The Malay, when he's cool, he's a very friendly fellow. He'll go out of the way to help you. But when you put his back against the wall, nothing can stop him. In this case, this Sergeant Jamil is back against the wall. He had his police station to protect. He had the wives and children to protect. And when the communists, 180 of them attacked his 20 men, and half of them were killed, the communists stopped firing and gave him the opportunity to surrender. You surrender and nothing will happen. And Sergeant Jamil, his fighting spirit being there, he rallied his men and all shouted back, "We will never surrender. We will fight until we die." And this is something which I can't understand until today. What made this, that powerful fighting spirit that he had? And this, to my mind, is the fighting spirit of these Malay warriors. I call them the policemen warriors of Bukit Kapur.
This is a story about 12 years of terror in Malaya. The communist insurgency of 1948 to 1960 had caused mayhem in the country. During this time, the security forces were in jungle green, and the bandits were, most of the time, caught or found dead in khaki brown. In the emergency, the Malayan Communist Party had two main branches. First, the guerrillas, comprising a few thousand men encamped in the Malayan jungles. The second was the Min Yuan, consisting of normal citizens, predominantly from the Chinese population. They supported the guerrillas by providing food, money, and information. Because of the Japanese brutality during the Second World War, some of the Chinese in the cities escaped and lived near the jungle edges. Here, the squatters planted vegetables and reared livestock, an easy food source for the communist guerrillas that created a big problem to the security forces. By now, it had been nearly 2 years since Sir Henry Gurney landed in Malaya as the High Commissioner. He had visited many parts of Malaya. In April 1950, Lieutenant General Sir Harold Briggs was dispatched by London as the Director of Operations in Malaya to work hand in hand with Gurney, a turning point for the fight against terrorism in Malaya. Briggs was given full powers of coordination of the police, army, navy, and Air Force. He quickly sat down with his team to plan and implement the anti-terrorist operations. Briggs formulated the State and District War Executive Committee. Coordination meetings were held on daily basis.
We discussed every morning what to do, of happenings in various villages, in the jungles, if you heard something about the communist activities. So we had to be very alert. We had to keep a lot of informers everywhere. And this is through the police net. So in Tampin district, I think we managed to kill 2 or 3, I think, in the Tampin area. We ambushed them. We got information from our agent, and they inform us that certain day and night they are coming to collect food, to bring them inside into the jungle, to feed their people inside. So once we know that, we decided to send our troops, military. We had a battalion of the Royal Fusiliers British Regiment, and some police, of course, to go into ambush.
The plan, popularly known as the Briggs Plan, later proved to be the most effective strategy in weakening the communist armed movement.
The essence of the Briggs Plan, of course, was to try and bring them under control. I mean, everybody knows this, and sever their links, cut short the opportunities that the insurgents had of obtaining information and food from them. There was the food denial campaign and so on.
On the 1st of June, 1950, Briggs was ready to implement his plan. Over 500,000 squatters were resettled into 500 new villages. Security forces put down their weapons and gave their hands in the resettlement process.
The ordinary mata-mata and the ordinary British Tommy. I watched them in action. You know, when you're resettling people and you're taking them away from their houses and you're going to bring them 20 miles away into a new village, it takes a bit of understanding. And both the ordinary SC and the ordinary British National Service Tommy was wonderful at this, without any training. You know, they get an old Chinese lady with hobbling feet. Come on, mother, I'll help you up into the truck, that sort of thing. That's hearts and minds. That sort of thing worked enormously well.
Some villagers traveled by road. Some were transported by train. Even fierce streams were not a problem. Each of the resettlement of squatters would establish a heavily guarded, well-protected by a force of special constables until its own home guard was formed. Villagers leaving the compound in the morning for the farm would be searched to ensure only adequate food for the day was carried out. At night, the gates would be closed and a strict curfew enforced.
The Briggs Plan worked very well. Naturally, there were people who called them concentration camps, a name which was first coined in the South African Boer War, I believe. There were people who said they were forced into these artificial... The fact is, they were given far better conditions. They had lighting, water, sanitation, and the barbed wire around them, as we were at great pains to point out, was obviously not to keep them in, because every day they went out to work. It was to keep the terrorists out. So the Briggs Plan, resettling, I don't know the figure, but many thousands of squatters, worked very well indeed.
To further separate the guerrillas from any supplies of food, Briggs introduced the communal cooking on rubber estates and new villages. The Briggs Plan was a great setback for the Malayan Communist Party. Malaya was now on a clear path towards freedom from the intimidation and violence of the communist terrorists. October 1951, early in the afternoon. The High Commissioner's car and the convoy were climbing the winding road to Fraser's Hill. At about 1:15 p.m., 9 miles short of the destination, the convoy was ambushed. Heavy automatic fire was directed from the right and rear, both against the High Commissioner's car and the escorting Land Rover. At this point, no one could save the High Commissioner. The communists had achieved their greatest triumph.
I'd been in Taiping to see my boss that day, and I recall quite vividly, before I went back, I went to have a drink at the Taiping club, and we got the news, Gurney's been killed. And the club, sort of like that, it tensed up like that. Morale just plummeted. You know, everyone, not only policemen, but, you know, district officers, the agriculture man, the forestry man, if they were in the club there, they all, maybe not, I don't mean to say they shouted and everything, but you could tell from their faces and, you know, the speech that they were, what's going to happen next? You know, what are we going to do now?
So technically, in Kuala Kubu district, he was ambushed just short of Gap police station, which was my district road. It was happen chance that he got Gurney. They were after anybody with a flag flying, a bigwig, and some rear admiral had gone up half an hour before, and they nearly shot him, but they waited, and they got, by sheer luck, bad luck for us, good luck for them, they got Sir Henry Gurney.
The murder shocked and horrified Malaya and the world. People of all races turned out to pay tribute to a brave and gallant man.
People of Malaya were anxious to see what London had to offer. Rumours were spreading on who was going to lead Malaya.
Eventually, there's a lot of rumours. At one time, I remember someone saying Field Marshal Montgomery was coming, but he didn't. Thank goodness. He would have been the wrong man.
Finally, Prime Minister Winston Churchill made up his mind. During Churchill's visit to Canada, he asked the man he had just chosen to follow him on the trip.
I didn't know that I was going to Malaya. I thought I was being interviewed like a cook to see whether I was suitable to go to Malaya. I knew before I went from the Colonial Secretary that I was to see the Prime Minister in Ottawa, who wanted to have a look at me. He was very much occupied with an important conference with many of the representatives and prime ministers of other countries in the Commonwealth, and he paid no attention to me at all. For the first 2 or 3 days, I saw him looking at me. As he once said, "I've been observing you," and I said, "Yes, I'm well aware of that fact, Prime Minister." But he never spoke to me at all, until about morning on my last night there, when he sent for me to get up out of bed and come and be interviewed by him, which I did. He told me before I left Ottawa that he thought that I was the right person for the job. Anyway, he'd take a chance on me, and that he wanted me to sort the business as quick as possible. He also said that if only I could induce these people in Malaya to come on the side of government, and if we defeated militant communism, that Malaya could have its independence. He hoped very much it to be within the British Commonwealth. But if they wanted it outside the British Commonwealth, well, tant pis, that was all right by him.
In February 1952, Sir Gerald Templar arrived in Malaya as the High Commissioner and Director of Operations. He was 53 years old.
After he came, things suddenly beat up, because he obviously had his own ideas how he wanted things done. He sensed and he felt that some people weren't doing enough for the emergency. There was too much, what's the word I want? There's too much coziness, if you know what I mean. They weren't taking the emergency seriously. And so he said, we've got to buck up. Most people did. Anyone who's still slack, biggie. Out.
Templar as an individual, I know even when I was a schoolboy, when he been out there, he's a very warm person. He wants to go out and talk to people. I, as a Boy Scout, did get into his house up in Kakosa, masa dulu tu, as a Boy Scout, to do odd job work, masa dulu as a Boy Scout, to get money get funds for the Boy Scout Association. My God, he would come and see you how you clean you use the brasso and clean the knife, fork and spoon. And he would do it himself too. I would do it this way, he would say, you know. And we followed, and we all had a chair. And of course, he was quite generous in giving us tea, biscuits and things like that. But he didn't spend long. He 1 or 2 minutes and then off he goes.
Templar told the people that the emergency could not be overcome by military measures alone. It had to be fought on social, economic, and political fronts as well. He called for greater effort from everyone. His first task was to streamline the security forces. Intensive training for all troops in the art of jungle warfare was organized. The military worked very closely with the police special branch that supplied the intelligence on the communist movement in the jungle.
The army operated against the hardcore of the terrorists in the jungle. It was the army's job to get into the jungle, find their bases and destroy them. And it was the police job to not only to police the country, but to provide through their special branch the very important information which the army could work on. So it was very much a combined operation between the police and the army.
In towns, Operation Service was launched by the Federation Police, aimed at winning the trust of the people. Psychological warfare was stepped up. Planes with loudspeakers flew over the jungles, propagating messages to the communists, asking them to give up the armed struggle. Leaflets by the millions were also dropped, inviting the terrorists to give up. The measures had many positive results. Questionnaires were also distributed to the people in the urban areas, asking for suggestions to improve their life. To gather more intelligence, the people could secretly mail in to Post Office Box 5000, Kuala Lumpur, on any information they had on communist activities. Rewards leading to capture or killing of the communists had been increased.
One of the things we were very enthusiastic about was getting the word out quickly to the Chinese community that somebody had surrendered. And here he was back with his family, having a good meal with his family. Now, their leaders, of course, had told them if they surrendered, they would be shot and tortured. Well, it became quite reasonably easy for us to prove this was nonsense. So then it got to the stage, you see, that the communists really got extremely angry if anybody read any of our leaflets. It was a it was actually a death penalty offence if you were caught with one of our leaflets, because it showed conclusively that the leadership was talking nonsense. So it was a very exciting time.
The High Commissioner travelled regularly, visiting security forces all over the country.
I was in one of those bad areas called Pago, Tanka. Every now and then you have communist terrorists attacking, and these communist terrorists usually attack about 2 or 3 in the morning. They attack the police posts or the home guard posts. And this happens about 4 in the morning, and to give you an idea, the situation happens at 4 in the morning. At 9 in the morning, General Templer from Kuala Lumpur, he's already down at my place.
Templer talked constantly to the people. He firmly believed that to win the war, it was necessary to win the hearts and minds of the people.
A lot of British people were running scared of General Templer. He tended to come to your district and up like a sort of bomb going off. He also carried a white swagger cane, military officer's cane, and he'd point, say, "You, what the devil are you doing about the emergency? What to Chinese? What are you doing to help? Eh? What information are you giving?"
New villages were high priority in Templer's work.
He made a great change to things because he was able to coordinate the army, the police, the planters, the civil service, to be working as one towards what eventually became the realization of Merdeka for Malaya and Malaysia.
Whatever plan that he did, he always said this, I only implement the BRICS plan. Templer believes in that plan, and he did. He executed it and modified it in whatever way possible. So in that sense, actually, a plan is a plan is a plan. Can somebody actually then execute it? No, you get to have a good man to do just that. Templer was the right man to execute BRICS plan.
Men, women, and children smiled and waved at the High Commissioner as he travelled round the country in his famous fact-finding tour. Within a short period, Templer was able to restore the country's confidence. This is a story about 12 years of terror in Malaya. The communist insurgency of 1948 to 1960 had caused mayhem in the country. During this time, the security forces were in jungle green, and the bandits were, most of the time, caught or found dead in khaki brown. The Goddess of Mercy Temple in Pulai, near Guamusang, Kelantan. The year was 1950. The communist guerrillas still had the upper hand. A bloody fight between the security forces and the guerrillas once took place here. Pulai is a village by the Nengiri River. The Chinese came here in the 15th century in search of gold. As the village was out in the thick jungle, communist guerrillas frequented this place to source for food and information. One day, while preparing for a religious celebration, the villagers were out in the jungle looking for atap roofing material for the temple. A group of police constables escorted the men. At about 10:30 a.m., upon returning to the village at Sungai Semur, the tributary of Sungai Nenggiri, the escorting party was ambushed by about 250 armed bandits. Lieutenant Hassan, the commanding officer, was shot in the head. Before he died, he told Corporal Jamaluddin Muhammad to take command. In the fierce fight, 17 members of the security forces were killed. 6 were captured. 29 bandits also lost their lives. The bodies of the murdered security forces were later brought to the Pulai village through these very stairs. Corporal Jamaluddin of the 3rd Battalion Malay Regiment was later decorated with the Distinguished Conduct Medal. A young Chinese boy, the son of the Penghulu, still lives to this day to tell of the brutality of the communist bandits. His own father was killed by the bandits.
So my father put one cook of one morning. He put one cook of villages go harvesting the body. On the way to the periphery, he was shot. He stopped by the communists and checked who is Bungulu. Normally, some of them may not know, like the communists don't know more about that. Some of them they know. Some of the people who also joined the communists. Those who know was that him, shot him. Shot, and he was on the leg, and then he was run into the battlefield and that collapsed. And then he get additional shot here and there.
Communist brutality in the Pulai village had inspired many of the villagers to join the security force. More than 10 young Chinese of the Pulai village later were recruited into the army and rose as high-ranking officers. When Templer arrived in 1952, he coordinated and expanded the security forces. The Malay Regiment, which had only 2 battalions at the start of the emergency, now had become bigger. By 1953, full-sized ambushes by the communists had been infrequent. By 1953, attacks on railways were also becoming uncommon. During its peak in 1950, ambushes on trains were so common that some went by unreported in the newspapers. Even the Malay rulers were not spared when it came to railway sabotage.
I was still in Nottingham University doing my LLB degree, and I heard this through radio, and we were very worried about it, of course. But we found out that my father was safe, except there's 1 people killed after the derailment and 4 injured, something like that. But since we were far away, we are very hard to think what was happening in Malaya at that time. But we saw the papers afterward of the incident. There was a railway train, number of trains have been derailed in Perak especially, but this was the first time in Negeri Sembilan, perhaps because my father was inside the train. They want to show that they can do something.
By now, the Briggs plan was in full swing. The communists not only were driven deep into the jungle, they began retreating north, starting from Pahang, Perak, and up to the Malaya-Thailand border. Headed by Chin Peng, the entourage travelled through Cameron Highlands, Pulai and Grik. In Grik, Perak, Chin Peng exposed himself to a Malay boatman who counted 52 men and women in the party. This was an important turning point. The communists were on the run. Miles away from Malaysia, a group of young Fijian soldiers had just completed their training and were ready to be deployed. It was the same century ago when young Fijians were about to be sent to Malaya. From 1952 to 1956, 10,000 Commonwealth Fijian troops were deployed in Malaya to fight the communist terrorists. And these are the little heard or known stories of their involvement in Malaya.
My name is Paul Manueli. I joined the army in 1952 and was sent to the UK in 1953 to be trained. I attended courses at Mons Officer Cadet School, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the Small Arms School at Hythe, and the Platoon Commander's course at the School of Infantry in Warminster. I then joined the battalion after that.
My name is Bill Slawby. I'm born and bred in Fiji, and educated overseas. I joined the army in 1950, and in 1952 we left to assist the Malayan government in the putting down of the communist insurgents who were giving them problems at that time.
I ran away from school and I was attracted to army uniform, army vehicles, their training, and all this kind of thing. And also at that time, we were doing military cadets at school. I wasn't good up here, let me admit that. I thought the place was in the army. So I enlisted in the army, I did my basic training, and then I was sent over to Malaya. And also another reason of my being attracted to the army was due to the fact that my elder brother was also in Malaya at that time, and he was accidentally shot at a place called Yong Peng, if I remember right.
My name is Mane Inibale. 1952, I still young on that time. I'm 29 years old when I went to Malaya, joining in the army. I can explain a little bit in Malay. Sekarang saya orang Tuan. Sekarang 81 saya tahu. Apa kabar awak? Baik. Terima kasih. Saya Malayan cakap, saya sik tahu. Banyak pandai. Saya orang Tuan now. Sik tahu. Saya Cakap saya apa saya tahu. I was joined India in 1951 to Malaya. We living here 1952. 18 January 1952. We traveling by mailboat here to Singapore. From here to Singapore, 10 and a half days we reached there. So, nice weather, everything was all right.
I had requested when I was still in the UK that if I could be posted direct to Malaya. I didn't hear anything for quite a while, so I had given up all hopes of going to Malaya until a matter of a couple of weeks before I was due to leave. Then I was told I was going direct to Malaya. I boarded a chartered flight and we finally arrived in Singapore. I was then picked up by troops from my own battalion and driven up to Butterpahat, where the battalion was based. There I was issued with all the necessary equipment, etc., and they posted me to D Company, which was based in Cha, and I was a platoon commander in D Company.
The communist terrorists have been living in Malaya for ages. They know Malaya very well. They know the inside out of the country. So they know where to run in the jungle. They know where to hide. And the British government look around to its member countries, seeing Fiji as a member of the Commonwealth, the vegetation and the type of life there are more similarities between the two countries. So they decided they must ask help in Fiji. So it was agreed by our chiefs. They made the appeal. The appeal was made throughout Fiji, and then I volunteered to go. I volunteered to go at that time up till now. I will never regret it. I have answered the calling of my chiefs. I've answered that, and yes, I must go. Even if it cost me my life, so be it. But I am proud to serve my chiefs, my country, and Her Majesty the Queen.
The terrorists, the communist terrorists, were very active. Apart from that, we were too busy going into training at Nisun Garrison and the surrounding areas to acclimatize ourselves with the type of terrain that we would have to handle during our normal patrol duties. So we were given a briefing on our enemy. We were told that they had been living in the jungle for many, many years, and they were very, very experienced jungle fighters. We were told that we should not take them for granted and that we should exercise care when we practice our slogan, which happened to be hunt and kill.
In the 10 months that I was actually operational, I spent a lot of time in the swamps of Johor. We were based in Butterpahat, but we operated all over Johor, as far east as Mersing. So we were deployed wherever there was a suspicion of terrorists being present in the area.
It came back to my mind that I just want to remember or to think how Malaya would have been and how Fiji would have been had our Fiji soldiers never been called. Otherwise, it won't be, Malaya won't be as it is now, and even Fiji won't be as it is now. And from there, I think there is a good relationship between the two countries, and all the time I used to think of those my friends that were killed there, although very few, but still we have to accomplish the task.
There's one thing all of us have in common, all of us, and that was that we were honored indeed to have played a part in the freedom of a country which none of us previously knew existed. We're honored indeed that you are now having the anniversary of your independence, and that we played a very small part in the achievement of that great goal. And we thank you. Our association with the Malayan government and its people has always been close. We hope that it becomes even closer in the years to come.
The communists had now retreated north to the borders. The remaining few were still deep in the jungle of Malaya. Food was in short supply. By now, the only help for the communists was from the Orang Asli. They constantly harassed them for food. During the emergency, there were 32,000 Aborigines of various groups scattered throughout the jungle. Some sympathized with the communist struggle and joined the group in fighting the security forces. Templar, however, acted quickly in order to win the hearts and minds of the Orang Asli. Government agencies provided assistance in building their huts, digging wells, and providing canned food, as in some parts of the jungle they were not allowed to plant crops due to the communists' frequent visits. Education was also not neglected. All these have come a long way. What used to be a jungle fort half a century ago is now a thriving Orang Asli settlement. Fort Brooke today is connected with a modern highway. It takes just 10 minutes to Cameron Highlands and about 1 hour to Guamusang in the north. By the end of 1953, Templar was in full gear in implementing the Briggs Plan. More communists had surrendered. Many had retreated north. Security forces now had the upper hand. About 3 years after the Briggs Plan was implemented, the situation in Malaya had greatly improved. Emergency restrictions were lifted. September 1953, Templar declared the first white area. Over 2,000 square miles along the coast of Malacca were declared white. Checking points were removed. Food controls were relaxed. Goods could be moved freely within the white area. Curfews were lifted. tappers could now take their meals to their workplaces. In Malacca, people were beginning to lead a normal life. Malaya was recovering. The worst was over. The danger of the communist raid had become rare, and everybody was looking forward to a better life. Briggs' plan and the emergency measures were a blessing. New villages and towns had become a thriving center of economy. Communist activities in town centers were now easier to handle as more and more special branch officers spoke the Chinese language.
The original special branch was very small indeed. It had virtually very few Chinese officers and was understaffed throughout the country. What we intended to do when I joined, I was one of the first people to join. I'd already by that time learnt Chinese, Hokkien, and it was quite useful talking or when translating, listening to what the replies were. And the object was to have special branch represented throughout the country, down to district level, operating against the communist terrorists. And then it changed to be expanded even further to concentrate on particular small important areas which were then attacked from the intelligence point of view, so the army and the police jungle squads could go in and fight the terrorists on their own country and on their own terms.
The Chinese, when you don't speak Chinese, they just look at you and walk past. The moment you speak Chinese, their faces light up. They have mobile faces. They are happy, they're pleased, and it makes your whole life different. As regards using my Chinese in action, as it were, in intelligence work, because when I finished the 2 years course, I was immediately put into the special branch. It made a huge difference. The attitude of a Chinese is when you speak his language, even if he's hostile, at least he knows he's speaking directly to you and no interpreter, because Chinese never trust an interpreter. So the difference was huge. And the cooperation was much more easily obtained.
1954, Templars' 2-year tour of duty was finally over. "The jungle has been neutralized," was one of Templar's famous quotes before he left Malaya. Templar's tradition lived on. In order to prepare the country for independence, he believed Malaya should have its own highly professional, multiracial military organization. Templar initiated the Federation Regiment, starting with 12 young men from various races.
There were about 600 of us, I think, and they were looking for 12 people in the first instance, and I think they were looking for a bit more matured people than school leavers, like people who had been working for a year or two, because like teachers who were a couple of years also got in the 12. I was a police officer. I think maybe with an exception of one, all of us started work already.
To prepare the people for democracy and eventually the first general election, a local council election was introduced in 1952. For the first time, the Malayans were introduced to the running of a democratic system. All citizens aged 21 and above were given the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. Malayans were now represented by their fellow Malayans to voice their opinions. 1955, the year of the first general election. The most significant feature of this event was a merger of the three major parties representing the three main races in Malaya. The campaign was lively. Merdeka for Malaya was the alliance's manifesto. On election day, a huge turnout was recorded. It was a landslide victory for the alliance. It won 51 out of 52 seats contested, proof that all Malayans were united for Merdeka. The country had chosen its first government, led by Tunku Abdul Rahman Putra as the first chief minister. The Tunku wanted the country to immediately move forward and wished to bring the emergency to an end as soon as possible. His strategy? To give an amnesty to the communists who surrendered. Chin Peng then sent a letter asking for negotiation. Tunku agreed to meet him, but only to clarify the terms of the amnesty. In order to prepare for the big meeting, what eventually was known as the Baling Talks, 3 preliminary discussions between the government and the Communist Party were held in Klian Intan town, Perak.
December 1955, I was on weekend leave in Penang. I received a call from Crow police station. I was told to go to Baling, and the Ahmad cars came and picked me up. I went to Crow straight. Reaching Crow, the OCPD told me to go to Klian Intan. I reached Klian Intan, the British police officers were all there, the army officers were there, and then they asked me to go into the jungle to meet Chintian, the second-in-chief for the Malayan Communist Party. I asked them a question, can I carry my arms or I just go in without my arms? He said, you can carry your arms. So I went in, it was dark, already late, about 7:30. I walked in for about 20 kilometers from Klian Intan town. I reached that area and I met Chintian and Lee Cheng He. Lee Cheng He had his grandmother's house in Klian Intan village. So we stayed there for 2 nights. And there were some questions coming up from Chintian, asking me questions, why did you join the police force? So I asked him, why did you become a communist? So he kept quiet.
Finally, on the 28th of December 1955, in the small town of Baling, north of Kedah, the talks between the government and the Malayan Communist Party were about to begin. In the vicinity, about 3,000 to 4,000 security forces had encamped here to ensure safety. People from all walks of life also turned out to watch the historical moment in the history of the country. On that day, a police driver, Nabi Ahmad, was given the task to drive Chin Peng from the jungle fringes to Baling.
Saya punya kereta, dua saya punya belakang champion, lepas Dio, lepas OSBD. Sebelah sana 3 orang squad, jungle squad punya. Kira dia pakai hijau punya baju. Satu dia punya ini champion tukang masak. Dia orang tukang masak pun bawa 2 orang. Dia orang tak boleh makan, kita punya masak tak boleh ambil punya makan.
Orang banyak, polis ada kurang-kurang 3,000 lebih. Itu jaga sekolah.
For these talks, Tunku invited the Chief Minister of Singapore, David Marshall, and the President of MCA, Datuk Tan Cheng Lock. Chin Peng brought with him senior party members Chen Tien and Rashid Maidin. Tunku wanted the communists to surrender, and Chin Peng wanted Tunku to legalize the Malayan Communist Party. Both could not agree on the terms.
If you look at him, you wouldn't think that he would be the villain that he was, or he's supposed to be. He looks very clean, a very nice-looking chap. And when we talked to him as man to man, he seemed to be very gentlemanly in his conduct. And so we had one whole day talking to one another on the terms of the truce or peace, on the peace terms. And then finally we came to this point that I asked him to surrender and lay down the arms if we get independence, because there is no point in fighting the same cause. And also to come out and play politics that is in keeping with the way of life of the Malayan people, which is free from British, the British way of life, free from the communist way of life, but to carry on in our way of life, happy-go-lucky sort of people. And then he said he will have time to consider. In fact, next day when we met, he came out. And it is the words that came from his mouth which I could never forget to the end of my day. He said, as between you and I, he said, you are anti-communist, I'm a communist. There can never be coexistence. So there's no point in my telling you that I laid down my arm. There can never be proper understanding. I will always carry on with my communist activities. And so, with that, we broke off. And I remember him for that. And that was one of the greatest lessons that have been I use as my guide throughout all the time I was Prime Minister of Malaysia. I think there will never be true peace with the communists.
The barling talks failed. Chin Peng then went back into the jungle and continued his struggle. The government, on the other hand, continued to intensify attacks on the last remnants of the communists. By now, the hardcore of militant communism had been suppressed. Success followed upon success. More communist guerrillas had surrendered, been captured, or killed. A retired soldier remembers how he defeated the few last communists in Sikamat, Seremban.
And then when I went there, literally there's no cover actually. What I did was I dig a hole. We buried ourselves. And we covered with rubber leaf, dry leaf, cover ourselves. We hide. Now because of that, the last thing, their agent, their observation that they have in the area with the rubber taper, they cannot see us. We really buried. Nampak kepala saja. Actually just surface our just for breathing. Otherwise we cover ourselves with dry leaf. And I tell you, they came. But the only thing we were caught because we were told they are coming from the north, but they came from the south. And only one person facing the south. The rest are all facing the north. The 3% are the ones there. And I cannot move because, I have a brand gun, the heavy gun. So I just signal to soldier. Originally, I thought I want to capture the leader because it's so near already. It was just about 3 yards. But then I noticed he got a stand gun, and he also got a hand grenade. So I said, if I do that, there is a chance. So I signal to the private with a palm gun, did the first shot. But I tell you, he was so quick, this guy. He managed to throw hand grenade before he collapsed.
the campaign had now moved up northward to the border. The Tunku went to Betong in Thailand to discuss with the Thai security forces. Both sides agreed to have joint operations against the guerrillas. Early in 1956, the Tunku flew to London for negotiations. His task now was to convince the British government that Malaya was ready for independence. On all points, the Tunku met with success. He obtained immediate control of internal security and the promise of full independence by the British in 18 months. This was 2 years ahead of Tunku's target. No other British colony had accomplished such an achievement. Besides an emergency that was still going on, the Tunku achieved the impossible and had carved his name in history. Back in Malaya, the Tunku's accomplishment stirred the people's imagination, and he was given a heroic welcome upon his return from the Merdeka mission. From that day, Merdeka had become the buzzword for all Malayans.
Tunku, Tun Razak and Tun Ismail lived in Talinggaya, and they came there in about 1956, so we got to know them. In fact, Tun Ismail used to take my eldest son with his children, Tawfiq and Zaila, into a kindergarten in KL with Dato Najib, who was also at the same kindergarten. So they all went to kindergarten together. And one day my son came back home and he said that the driver had been teaching him Malay. So we said to him, what is it? What did you learn? And he said, Merdeka.
So fascinated with Merdeka, in 1956, a Fijian soldier in Batu Pahat named his newly born son Merdeka.
We just thought it was a Malaysian name. We didn't know the significance of the name Merdeka until much later on. But it was a reminder of their time here. And he's now a teacher in Fiji, well, he's a young man and a teacher in Fiji. And we call him fondly by Merdeka, rather than his other Fijian names.
Akan tercapai pada 31 hari bulan 1957. Dan pada hari itu, suatu peristiharan ataupun proclamation akan dibaca di hadapan Duke of Gloucester sebagai wakil Baginda Queen, dan di hadapan tamu-tamu dan orang-orang di tanah Melayu ini. Barang siapa yang ada dekat dengan stadium dapat didengar, dan barang siapa yang jauh boleh didengar di rumah masing-masing daripada radio. Merdeka! Merdeka!
A year later, Merdeka became a reality.
Merdeka! 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 Merdeka!
Soon after the Merdeka celebration was over, anti-communist rallies were organized to show that people wanted peace and not armed struggle. Many of the rallies were led by Tunku himself. Also, after Merdeka, amnesty was once again offered. So effective was the Merdeka offer that it was extended twice by the government. By 1958, 646 communist terrorists had taken advantage of the most generous terms of surrender. White areas spread from 20 to 80% of the entire country. 1955 Barling talks had failed. After the Barling talks, till the Merdeka celebrations, nothing was heard from Chin Peng until the middle of October 1957. A letter arrived at the Prime Minister's office. In the 2-paragraph letter, Chin Peng was asking for further negotiations. The Prime Minister ignored the request as Chin Peng would not accept the principle of surrender.
There were pressures from the CPM and people to whom the CPM had written, asking for a second round of Barling talk. And Tengku said, no way, no way. We will have a people's war against them, and we will have another round of national service. So that was the first round, 1952. So this was the second round. So I registered myself for that second round. I felt so patriotic at that time. I registered, but they started to collapse, and so there was no call up, just a registration. My number was 1618. I still remember that. 1618, 58. Then, so I joined voluntarily the police.
From this time onward, the strength of the Communist Party began to decline. The remaining guerrillas doggedly fought on, but they were now forced back deeper into the jungle.
And in the police that time, I became aware that the communists militarily had been defeated from as early as 1956, 57, And when I joined, we still had jungle patrols to do in Pahang, in Perak, in Johor, in Penang. Penang was one of the last places to be freed of the communists. Strange enough, small island, and then in the northern border. We suffered, I think, in 1959, 1960, my first 2 years in the police, we suffered only one policeman killed, no military officer killed. Whereas 21 communist terrorists were killed, 21 captured, and I think 92 surrendered between 59 and 60.
By this time, many of the Commonwealth troops had gone back to their respective countries. From 1955 till 1959, the campaign in Malaya saw a big-scale involvement of another Commonwealth country, Australia.
My first day in Malaya, well, of course, we arrived in Singapore, and it was just around the time of independence. And we were somewhat surprised when we got there to find that we had to move around in buses with protection against grenades. There were wire frames and screens all around the bus. So that was an unusual introduction, but it brought home to us the fact that this was a country that was going through, and still was, going through a lot of turmoil.
The first 2 years, 57, 58, I was posted to the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and we were based mainly at Kuala Kangsar in central Perak, and then in Ipoh, and then later on near Lhasa, northeast of Sungai Siput. I served in 3 different company bases there, and in my last year I was an instructor at the Jungle Warfare School at Kota Tinggi.
It was a completely new experience for most of us. I mean, there were a lot of Australians in Malaya as it was during World War II, but we were a new generation coming in. So to see all the kampongs and to see the new villages that had been established, get some idea of life in the tropics on the peninsula, it was all very new. We had very comfortable barracks, I have to say, in Kuala Kangsar, in the grounds of the old Istana. But we quickly had to get into the routine there.
Well, Malaya was a well-administered country. We were very pleased that Malaya just got its independence, and it was a very orderly society.
we had, the police were pretty much in control. That was under the Malaya government, and the military worked in close cooperation with them. And the people in the cities lived pretty normally. There were just a few areas which were called black areas where we had to watch out for the communist terrorists. But life was pretty orderly in Malaya at the time.
From 1950, Australia had provided aircraft, navy ships, artillery, engineering and signals units.
Well, we came in late in the emergency, and at that stage there were only known to be about 40 terrorists left in the whole of that area of North Perak up towards the border. And so it was essentially patrolling, and it became monotonous because it was a bit of a grind. You actually had to get out there and carry all your rations in. Very rarely did we get an aerial drop, parachute drop of supplies. More often than not that you had to carry it in. So you would take, say, 2 weeks' rations on your back, go into some base area and put the rations, hide them, and then patrol out from there. And it was painstaking work. I mean, you would have to go, if we covered a map square, about a kilometre by a kilometre each day, we thought we were doing very well.
The most significant success for the Australian Army came on the 20th of November, 1958, when a jungle camp was discovered and attacked.
And on one occasion, this was on the 20th of November, 1958, one of our platoons found some fresh tracks of 4 to 5 communist terrorists, and they radioed battalion headquarters and they sent me and my tracking team out. I had 11 men altogether, counting myself, 4 E-Barns, and I had 6 other Australian soldiers with me. And we followed the enemy for about an hour or so, and when it was almost dark, we saw this camp in front of us up some rocks. And I couldn't do the normal quick attack because the enemy would have shot us easily because we were in the open and they were behind rocks. So I took 4 men around the back of the enemy camp. And by some miracle, they didn't hear us, and then we tried to attack them from the back and drive them into 6 men I had in ambush below the camp. And I couldn't see the enemy exactly. I could see them moving around, and I threw a grenade in there, and we all fired, the 5 of us, coming around the back. And the enemy fired back and threw a grenade, but then they ran into the ambush, which I placed at the bottom of the hill, about 40 metres away, and they ran into that.
3 of the camp's occupants were killed. One of them was identified as a member of the group which ambushed Sir Henry Gurney 7 years earlier. Despite the emergency, the country was progressing fast. By 1960, the security situation was conducive to declaring an end to the emergency. Most of the communist terrorists had fled to southern Thailand. The remnants of the guerrillas in Malaya, however, no longer posed a threat to the security of the country. On the 30th of July, 1960, Tunku Abdul Rahman signed the proclamation repealing the 12-year-old Emergency Regulations Ordinance.
Bercadang hendak mengisytiharkan darurat ini tamat pada 31 hari bulan Julai.
regiments from all 7 battalions of the Royal Malay Regiment. By their valour and outstanding successes, the regiment has added new lustre to its glorious tradition, a tradition founded on skill, daring and devotion to duty. Tracker dogs are also on parade, and behind come the Federation Reconnaissance Corps, previously known as the Federation Regiment. The Royal Malayan Navy smartly marches past the saluting base, followed by the Royal Federation of Malaya Police. No other service acquitted itself with more distinction during the emergency. Men of the Sonoy Pra, the fighting Aborigines. The Territorial Army, and behind the Special Constables whose important role was the defence of our vital industries. And now, the Royal Malayan Naval Volunteer Reserve. In the parade too are veteran servicemen, as well as representatives of the St. John's Ambulance Association and the Red Cross. Presenting a changing kaleidoscope of high-precision marching are units of Commonwealth forces. Malaya is deeply indebted to these, her friends from the Commonwealth, for their noble and signal contributions in helping to bring the emergency to an end. Colour parties from Kenya, Rhodesia and Fiji. But of all the Commonwealth forces who fought in Malaya's war, none have a more impressive record than the Gurkhas. These sturdy fighters from the hills of Nepal will always be remembered with gratitude and affection.
Malaya had become Malaysia. In the middle of the 1960s, the Communist Party had embarked on a recruitment campaign inspired by the success of the Viet Cong in Vietnam.
They left behind here people to do the United Front work, penetrate the political organizations, penetrate the trade unions, penetrate the students' organizations. And that's where I found my role in the initial stages. So we had to cover this. We had to cover this communist penetration.
From their sanctuary in southern Thailand, the communists launched attacks and sabotages on security forces.
I became IGP as a result of one of the most major reprisal. That was the killing of my own boss, the then IGP Tan Sri Rahman Hashim. Then I became the IGP, so that was a major thing. But preceding that, we had a series of assassinations of individual police officers in Serdang, Malim Nawa, Sungai Siput, Kuala Lumpur, Seremban, you know.
A series of attacks from 1970 till 1975, however, brought the Communist Party of Malaya to nowhere.
By 76, after that euphoria of the caused by the American defeat in Vietnam, you see, they found they couldn't make headway. They thought they could make almost instant headway in this country. You know? In fact, Rashid Maidin was telling his people at the border, you just wait. We'll be sitting Bukit Aman. We'll be opening all the files.
Finally, 1989 marked the final chapter of the communist struggle in Malaysia. After a series of peace initiatives, Chin Peng decided to end the hostilities.
At first, when we can approach to talk with some member of the CPM, and they come out from Betong, from the jungle in Betong to Hat Yai, and we talk, and I decided to turn my counterpart, military. So Malaysian military said that no policy to talk with something like that, to negotiation. So Mr. Yao Kong Yu, he the deputy of the Royal Malaysian Special Branch, come and see me at my office and asked me to work with me
about the secret talk or something to solve the problem. So I agree with him, and we start to work together.
I was very keen to end this whole thing because they were just a nuisance, and they were distracting our government, attention, you see, from the more necessary job of developing the country, you see. And also, I was conscious of the development of the military forces around us in the other countries. They were more conventional. And I thought our own military needed to go that way. But they cannot go that way when we are concentrating on this problem, you see. So that was why I was keen to see this ended.
Well, by that time, the guerrillas were no longer active. They had planted some mines which was hurting our people in our territory. But even that, they stopped. And I think over time, the mines become deactivated by themselves. So there was really no fight. And we see no point in keeping this up. As if we are still in a state of emergency, we're fighting a war and all that.
The tripartite peace treaty comprising Malaysia, Thailand and the Malayan Communist Party was signed in Hat Yai on the 2nd of December 1989.
Tuan-tuan dan puan-puan yang dihormati. Perwakilan kerajaan Thailand, kerajaan Malaysia.
The thing that ran in my mind was, if Chin Peng was to offer his hands to me, would I shake his hand? A question, of course, is this, that if I do shake his hand, the reaction of our soldiers, you know, some of soldiers were killed, maimed, what would they say? War is not a good thing. Let's continue with peace. And so Chin Peng did offer his hand, and I shook his hand. But nobody has asked me, how dare you shake his hand? But I think people also realize the time has come to go for peace rather than fight, in a sense. But it's soul searching, I can tell you. I can tell you, it was soul searching on my part. And I locked myself in the room, trying to figure out, now, my God, what do I do? I just, implication, do I just push his hand away and walked out, or whatever it is? That's not a good move. We have gone so far to achieve that level of success, that is to bring them across.
Today, most of the members of the Communist Party are living peacefully in southern Thailand. During the emergency of 1948 to 1960, over 4,000 members of the security forces and civilians were killed. About the same number were wounded or missing. Half of the 12,000 communist guerrillas who served under Chin Peng were killed. The remaining had surrendered, been captured, or were executed by their commanders.
We fought men in the jungle. They are armed terrorists. We have to fight them. We fought them in the jungle. We send our jungle squads. We send the police field force. We send the military to fight them. But at the same time, we also engage in a psyops battle against them. We have to win the hearts and minds of the people. We have to make the people understand that we are a government of the people. You put us in government. So you have to improve the people's life.
Indeed, Malaysia is among a very few countries in the world today that have won a communist insurgency.